Okay, since training involves the act of learning, obviously we need to consider the principles of learning that would be applicable to the training process. Okay? As we've described previously, we're going to do a training needs analysis to figure out what the objectives are, what the design of the training should be. But yet we need to consider the characteristics of the person that is going to be trained, or the person that is doing the training, or the design itself can all affect the process of learning. Okay, so training must make a difference. Okay, and as we're going to get at the very end of this video, we're going to talk about transfer of training. Training is all lovely. If you score an 80% at the end of the training, that's great. You learn the material. However, will you use the material later on when you get back to your job? See, that's what really matters. Okay? Obviously, we could draw upon reinforcement theory. We can create behavioral change by manipulating consequences, right? The law of effect. Behaviors followed by a satisfying state of affairs are more likely to be repeated in the future. So if you give reinforcement immediately after a correct behavior, so in some training, they're just going to use things like fun-sized candy bars. Oh, when you get the correct answer, here's a candy bar. Okay, so that is possible. Okay? Unfortunately, most training falls onto social learning theory in the form of behavioral modeling. That behavior change can occur, and I mean, we've all seen Bandura's Bobo doll studies, and when children watch an adult role model that is aggressive, they tend to become aggressive. Okay, and so if you observe the behavior of a model, you are likely to imitate that model. Okay? But one of the biggest things, and this is what am I trying to say? This is Ebbinghaus, Hermann Ebbinghaus, the guy that created the learning curve, or forgetting curve more importantly. Ebbinghaus discovered a lot of things about the process of learning, but one of the things he learned is that there are distinctly different outcomes if you use distributed practice versus mass practice. So with distributed practice, let's say you have 5 hours of training, but it is spread in 10 30-minute blocks. Okay? The outcomes of 10 30-minute blocks is completely different than if somebody sat down for 5 hours and did all of it. Okay? So clearly you need to consider not just, how much training, how many hours, what's the topic, but how do you present it? Okay? So it depends on what kind of task you have. It depends on what you're looking at. Okay? Another very important principle of learning is memory is much better with meaningful materials. I mean, again, Ebbinghaus established a forgetting curve using nonsense syllables, right? He used nonsense syllables and he found this real, but then he discovered that if the thing to be memorized has meaning, then it is better remembered. And in fact, even more than that, information that is personalized, that is somehow connected to you, is much better remembered than material that is like unconnected to you. Okay, so the impact of practice and overlearning. Overlearning is the idea that you've learned it. That is to say, you got 80% on the quiz, but you keep learning it even after you've learned it. When you overlearn, it becomes almost automatic or reflexive. Okay? So you can change behaviors in ways that are reflexive rather than, well, I know it. No, reflexively. This is the only way. One of the most important parts of training is feedback. Absolutely feedback. And again, when I'm watching these training videos, they'll have these questions interspersed throughout the videos. And you answer the question, and then the next video is going to be, that is correct, or that is wrong, and the reason it is wrong is, and so inevitably, in fact, the last training video I had, it didn't matter if you were correct or incorrect, it went to the same feedback, and I thought that was so stupid. Alright, there should be two different outcomes. If you get the answer right, this feedback. If you get the answer wrong, that feedback. But nope. But the feedback was not just, correct or incorrect, but it was why. Why is the correct answer B or whatever it was? Okay. But when it comes to feedback, and this is an important thing, is that feedback is good. Without feedback, how do I know what's going on? And there's different types of feedback, knowledge of results, knowledge of performance. There's lots of different feedback. There's a lot of work on feedback in IO Psych, which is fascinating in its own right. But one aspect of feedback, which is somewhat simpler, is the specificity of feedback. So if you give no feedback at all, you're not going to get any learning, okay? This doesn't happen. If you give incredibly inspecific, like incorrect, you don't get much change, okay? But you start to add to the specificity here, and what you're going to find is the more information, the more learning that occurs. But there's going to be some critical point where if you give too much or too specific feedback, you start to get a decrease in performance again, okay? So clearly you need to be specific, but you need to know when to stop, okay? Readiness, and this is actually a very important thing, that the trainees, the people to be trained, maybe they're not ready. And so there has been, remember that the single most important predictor, remember there are many predictors out there, but the predictor which is most valid across just about any occupation is G, or general intelligence. General intelligence predicts job performance across, no matter how you define job performance, and we've discussed how big that is. And it turns out that this G, or general intelligence, is also associated with effectiveness of training, okay? That the higher the the general intelligence level, the more effective training is. But we also find that individuals come in with different characteristics, and as you can imagine, this performance orientation and mastery orientation, as you can imagine, these things are clearly tied to the big five personality characteristics. Remember our ocean: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, right? So our big five are clearly related to these performance and mastery orientation. So clearly certain people or certain personality types are more accepting of the feedback. Now, the trainers, and again, we find we could go so basic and go back to Bandura again, and we could say, look, when a male demonstrated aggressive behavior, boys were more aggressive than if a female demonstrated aggressive behavior. So simple things like similarity between the trainer and the trainee, okay? But also the way that the trainer establishes their objectives, the degree to which a trainer recognizes that each individual learns differently, depending on, and this is why, by the way, at least in my experience, all the training that I have been exposed to, at least for the last 15 years, has been outsourced. That is, the company I'm working for has not created the training materials and has very little to do with the training materials, except they pay an outside organization that creates the materials. And that is okay for a smaller organization, but if it's a larger organization, you probably want to have an in-house person. And finally, as we said, I mean, we can talk about training all day long and the learning process. If it doesn't transfer, oh, I got 100% on the quiz at the end of training, but when I went back to my job, I just blew it off. Well, that doesn't help at all, okay? So clearly, one of the biggest things to focus on is not just how good the training worked at the point of training, but did it actually make an impact on the job? Remember, you did a training needs analysis and said, here's where I want to be, here's where I am. Obviously, transfer of training is, does it do what we said it was going to do?